micro. So there's the kind of substantive gap, and that's what you want to address. Okay. So it'll depend on your study and the state of the literature in your particular field, the kind of argument that you develop. Okay. But it's great to see that all of you are thinking about how you're going to build that argument in your literature review, because that's what's really important. Okay. Right. Yes.
I'm sorry to
sure.
In 10 words, conceptual gap.
Conceptual gap. So what I was thinking about there is that maybe you could call it theoretical or conceptual gap. That's where particular kinds of theory haven't been used in relation to a particular topic or field. So, for example, there might, just to give an example from yesterday, someone was looking at issues around gender and was it luxury goods?
Yes.
Okay. And you're saying, that people haven't often looked at those two kinds of bodies of theory and brought them together. So that would be more like a theoretical or conceptual gap, using gender theory to think about luxury goods and branding or whatever that term was, which I can't remember. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, good. Right, I think we're going to have a short break now. We have got some refreshments outside, and let's just see what the time is now. It's 10:18. So can we start again at 25 to 11? Would that be okay? And then we'll go on to the next one, which is more the theoretical gap.
Sorry.
Yes, sure.
Where do you put this paragraph where you show your argument? Is at the beginning of your literature chapter, so in your introduction?
Look, it's hard for me to say where, because I think it depends on how you're organizing it and your own particular style. I think it could come in the beginning. So you might say, in this literature review, I'm going to argue that there's this kind of gap and da-da-da-da, right? So that would be fine. Otherwise, you could actually develop it as you're going through the literature review, or you might focus your argument at the end of the literature review. So I think, or you might do it in all of those places. So it really depends on your style and how you're organizing the literature review. Okay. I don't think there's one answer to that. But the underlying thing is that you do need to develop an argument, however you structure it, and you're justifying your choice of a theoretical or conceptual framework. Right. So you're saying, again, it's trying to move beyond description. So not just saying this is what the theory is, but saying this is why I've chosen it and how I'm going to use it. Okay. So that's really important for creating a line of argument around theory. Okay. Because again, as is the case with methodology, there's so many options in theory. You can choose a number of different theories usually to look at a particular issue or problem. So you need to say, yes, but this is the one that I'm choosing for these reasons. Okay. And then be able to substantiate and justify that. Right. So the possible lines of argument here might be that the theory or concepts have been used in similar studies. Right. So you might say that people in the past who are looking at this topic have used this kind of theory. Therefore, I'm going to build on that by using the same kind of theory. And that's a legitimate line of argument. But you might say that I'm going to draw on a different body of theory because it's particularly useful, but it hasn't been used before. And then you'd have to make an argument for why this unused theory is valuable in this context. Okay. And that would be a different kind of approach. And again, that's a bit harder because other people haven't used it before. So you'd have to be able to find good reasons, maybe by looking at how it's been used in other contexts and showing how it's relevant to your area of study and making the case for it. Yeah. The theory or concepts help me to understand the study in a useful way. So you might say, this theory is going to help me to analyze the data particularly helpfully. And in that way, it's giving me conceptual tools that will help when I look at the data. That might be a justification. And then finally, help to analyze and interpret data in illuminating ways. So it's going to give you new insights. So you can think about your particular theoretical or conceptual framework and what which line of argument is appropriate for that. I think this is a really difficult line of argument to develop. And I was just talking to Brian about it, that how quite often when students present proposals, they'll have the theory and they'll have the design, but there's no kind of connection between them. So it is really tricky to try and work out what is the line of argument which connects my research design to my theoretical or conceptual framework. Okay? And that's what you have to try and work out. So why am I choosing this particular theory? Right? It's not good enough just to say because it's there. Okay? You have to you have to be able to say I'm choosing it because it's appropriate for my particular study. Okay? And if you are saying it's appropriate, you need to be able to say why is it appropriate. Okay? So you might say this particular theory is giving me conceptual tools which help me. First of all, it might help you to formulate your questions. Right? So you might take ideas from the theory and help you formulate your questions. Right, so just, again, I'm out of my depth in management, but if I take an example from economics, I don't know if there's sense theory around capabilities. I don't know if any of you have come across that. But he's got this different approach to economics where he's emphasizing human freedoms. And he looks at that in terms of human functionings and human capabilities. Right? So you might say, I'm using sense theory because it'll help me to organize my questions. So my questions are, what are the functionings of this group of people in this area of the economy? What are their capabilities? You see, so you're drawing concepts from the theory to help you formulate your questions. That could be one way of using theory. And then you might also use the theory to help you analyze the data. Right? So as you're looking at the data, you draw ideas from the theory to thematize your data analysis. But you have to think about how you're going to use that theory and why you're going to use that theory. Does that make sense? Yeah. Do you have a sense of that for your own particular study? Yes?
You've chosen a particular theory. I remember in labor relations,
yes,
when we're talking about unions and all of that.
Right.
There's a particular theory whereby management regards unions as a threat.
Yes, right.
Just regard them as people who don't want to see productivity in the organization,
okay,
etc.
Right.
So let's say you propose that during the initial stage while you are showing your theory, but through literature, you later find literature that points to the direction that the current state of labor relations or unions points to that there needs to be that cooperative between management and
yes,
be able to change the theory while you are progressing.
While you're busy with the study. It's a good question.
You have to be stuck to that. Management just views unions as disruptive and not cooperative.
Yeah. It's hard to answer the question, and maybe you can help me with this, Brian. But I think that it depends on how you're using the theory, I'd say. Because if you're using the theory to conceptualize your whole study, okay, and to formulate your research questions and all of that, then it might be quite difficult to change the theory. But if you're using it more as a kind of a broad framework for understanding the problem, then quite often you do change or develop that as you're going along. Right. Remember, a proposal is really just a plan. The plan might, it always does change in some way as you're doing the research. And you might find that as you're doing the research, new ideas emerge from the study that you hadn't thought about at the beginning. I remember when I was doing my PhD, I was doing case studies of adult education projects. And it was young adult learners in sort of Soweto area. And right near the end of the study, I suddenly had an idea around dialogic space. Right. So this idea helped me to understand what I was researching. So it almost gave me a theoretical framework that came out near the end of the study. So then I remember I was in the shower at the time. Okay. So then I had to quickly get out of the shower and dress and whatever. But go and read more about dialogue and try and then go back to my literature review and build that section into it. Right. So those ideas came out of the study rather than starting with the study. So you can certainly develop your theoretical framework and add new elements into it, and even challenge the theoretical framework, because you might find that the data that you're collecting doesn't sit easily with the theory that you started with, and then that's a really valuable finding, actually. Okay, does that help you? Okay, I think the other question that was coming out was around what if you don't want to start with a theory? Okay. Maybe your study is more that you want to find theory or generate theory. And that is a valid approach. Right? So if you start with a theory, it's often called a deductive approach or a theory testing approach. Right? So you've got this theory, and now you're going to apply it to your particular research context and see whether it's useful or not. Right. So that would be testing the theory. And that's one model. But another model is to say, no, I don't want to start with the theory. I want to start with the study itself and see what insights the study yields and whether I can generate new ideas or even a new theory from the study. So that would be more an inductive approach or a theory generating approach. And both of those are valid ways of doing research and important ways of doing research. Right. So the first one is more, applying and testing theory. The second one would be a more exploratory approach where you're trying to generate or develop theory. Okay. If you think about your own study, does that make sense? Oh, sorry, did you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, so I want to ask a question
Sure.
Relating to your literature review and your theory.
Yes, yes.
So theoretically you would have done a fair amount of literature review, and
Yes.
so-and-so studied X and so-and-so studied Y, and person X used this theory to understand this phenomenon, and
Yes.
the other person used another theory. Should you be mentioning that in your literature review, sort of in passing, and then sort of build on it, do a proper sort of thing of, okay, there are all these theories out there, but I'm using this one
Yes.
in your theory part? Or should you just sort of not even mention earlier that they're using that theory or that theory? Or
Yes.
whatever?
Thank you. I think that's a really valuable question because, I think there's different ways of doing it. Right. So some people would combine the theoretical sort of approach with the literature review, and almost thematize the literature in relation to the main ideas, and then from that they generate their theoretical framework. It could even be in the same chapter. Right. So that would be one way of doing it. Another way would be to focus the literature review more on the empirical research. So what have people found out about the problem? And then you'd have a separate chapter where you're looking at the theory. Okay. And I think both of those ways are fine. And it just depends on how you want to do it and what works for you. Okay. And then, again, people were raising the issue of theoretical framework or conceptual framework. That's also a tricky one. And again, sometimes people use those synonymously, but I think it's useful to distinguish between them. The way I'd understand a theoretical framework is if you're using a whole theory. Right. So, for example, you might be using, say, human capital theory or capabilities theory, and that's guiding your study as a whole. And then from that theory, you're drawing the concepts and perhaps using the concepts to frame your questions and using them to help you analyze your data. Right. So that would be a theoretical framework. A conceptual framework would be you're not buying into a whole theory. You're just taking certain concepts, and it might be from different theories. And then you're kind of linking them up to help you understand your study and to understand your data. And I think that you were giving us that example. Right. So in your example, you're looking at expatriate academics, right? And in your study, that means you're drawing on different disciplines. There's not one discipline or one theoretical framework, but the ideas from different disciplines that will help you to understand your study. For example, that idea of, was it migrants? Academic mobility. Right, so that's one concept. And then there might be other concepts from other disciplines, which you might then link in a conceptual framework. Right. So a conceptual framework would be a framework of ideas that help you to understand your study, but they don't form a whole theory. Okay. Does that make sense? So if you think about your study, are you using a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework? Are you able to answer that question for yourself? Okay. Theoretical. Okay. And in your study, are you following a deductive approach or a more inductive approach? Deductive. So just from your answers, you're starting with a theory. Yeah? You've got a clear theory. What theory are you using? Systems theory. Okay. And then you're going to apply that theory to a particular context of research and see whether it, and how it helps you to understand that. Right. So that would be more theory testing and deductive. Right. Is anybody going the other way around, where you're trying to develop theory or generate theory? Yes? Would you mind just telling us briefly?
I have a background in non-profit organizations, and
yes.
the non-profit organizations fall into different classes. So you'll get Section 27, which will try and bat the government into touch with regard to education, and you'll have welfare NPOs which simply look to provide well-being. They'll provide water, they'll provide classes, they'll provide welfare services, and what have you. There is a school of thought that believes that the NPO sector is in fact the tail end of a liberation revolution, which is a falsehood, but it's a construct which I think doesn't have much sway anymore. I'm looking specifically at welfare NPOs and whether the state's policy of, there's several angles here. I'm looking specifically at whether the state's policy of funding NPOs or subsidizing them,
yes.
because welfare NPOs are subsidized typically with salary subsidies or the number of beds you might have in an old age home or whatever the case might be. I don't know that that's a particularly efficient method of achieving welfare provision.
Yes.
As a policy objective, because I don't know that NPOs are in fact found in the areas of greatest need.
Okay, right.
NPOs are likely to establish in areas where there are people who can establish NPOs.
Yes.
Which is typically not where indigent people necessarily are.
Yes, yes.
So we might be missing a trick over here in terms of how we allocate state resources.
Yes.
For myself, I don't know if my tax money is being spent right.
Okay.
In many ways, and but there are many perspectives. I'm simply looking at comparing those two things and saying, is there a connection or is there? I'm not hypothesizing a directional relationship.
Okay, right.
I'd
Yeah.
like to find out if there is.
Yes, yes. Okay,
and
great.
we'll establish a theory from that.
Yes. So that's more like an exploratory study. You're saying this is the situation. I want to look at the relation between these things,
yes.
And then from there, it's open-ended.
It's exploratory. It's conceptually underpinned, and it's inductive reasoning.
Okay, and then from that you might develop certain ideas about the relationship, which might lead to a connection between ideas and a possible theory, right? So you see, that's the other way around, where it's a more inductive study, where it's more exploratory and possibly theory building, depending on what comes out.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So I think those are two good examples of different ways of doing it. Quite often it's not so clear cut, Sometimes there's more like a dialogical relation between theory and research, where you might be beginning with certain concepts, but you develop other concepts, and then it's kind of deductive, inductive. So they're more like it's more like a continuum, I think, and there's rarely completely pure deductive or inductive studies. Okay, so as long as you're starting to work out the answers for yourself around theory and thinking about how do I develop an argument for my theoretical choices? Okay, so that's what we were doing. Let's go on to method.